On the morning of July 4th, 2026, 18-year-old Nolan Wells set out for what was supposed to be a carefree holiday on Horn Island, a popular destination just off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Friends described the trip as a celebration filled with boats, swimming, music, and hundreds of young people enjoying Independence Day weekend. By the end of that day, Nolan had disappeared. Nearly 2 days later, search teams found his body in the waters surrounding the island. Within hours, local officials suggested the tragedy appeared to be an accidental drowning. But for Nolan's family, that conclusion came far too quickly. They believed there were still too many unanswered questions. How did an experienced swimmer suddenly vanish without anyone realizing he was missing? Why did his friends return to the mainland without him? And perhaps most confusing of all, how did his cell phone make it back to shore while Nolan never did? Those questions transformed what first appeared to be a tragic accident into one of the most closely watched investigations in Mississippi. As public attention grew, the family hired nationally known civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump. They also requested an independent forensic examination, hoping a second autopsy might reveal answers that the first examination could not. When the private autopsy report was finally released, many people expected it would confirm either an accident or foul play. Instead, it did neither. The report concluded that both the cause and manner of Nolan's death remained undetermined. That single word immediately fueled more debate across social media. Some believed it proved investigators had overlooked critical evidence. Others argued it simply reflected the limitations of conducting a second autopsy after the original medical examination had already been completed. To understand why the report stopped short of giving definitive answers, forensic experts explained that a second autopsy is very different from the first. During an official autopsy, medical examiners remove and closely inspect every major organ. They often preserve certain tissues, the brain, or delicate neck structures for additional laboratory testing. By the time an independent pathologist examines the body days later, many of those structures have already been removed or altered as part of the normal forensic process. That means the second examiner is working with incomplete evidence through no fault of their own. According to forensic pathologists familiar with the process, this is one of the biggest challenges in any independent examination. The second doctor can review what remains, identify possible concerns, and compare findings with the original report. But some observations simply cannot be recreated. In Nolan's case, decomposition also created additional difficulties. His body had spent nearly 2 days in the summer heat before being recovered from the water. As decomposition progresses, tissues change rapidly. Blood settles into different areas. Fluids shift throughout the body. Colors that may initially appear suspicious can actually be natural post-mortem changes. Because of those factors, forensic pathologists must be extremely careful not to overinterpret what they see. One of the findings that immediately attracted public attention involved an area of red discoloration on the back of Nolan's head. During the family's press conference, attorney Benjamin Crump emphasized that the private pathologist considered this finding important enough to document carefully. Online speculation exploded almost instantly. Many people assumed the discoloration proved Nolan had suffered a violent blow to the head before entering the water. But forensic experts urged caution. A bruise alone does not automatically indicate homicide. According to specialists who reviewed the report, several possibilities must always be considered. The discoloration could represent a true injury. It could be the result of blood pooling after death. Or it could simply be an artifact created by decomposition and previous autopsy procedures. Most importantly, the private examination found no skull fracture beneath the area. There were also no scalp lacerations or major bleeding patterns that would normally accompany a fatal impact to the head. Without those additional injuries, forensic experts say it is impossible to conclude that this discoloration caused Nolan's death. It may have been significant, or it may have been entirely unrelated. At this stage, science alone cannot provide that answer. That uncertainty became one of the central themes of the entire investigation. The private pathologist repeatedly emphasized that several critical questions remained unanswered because important structures were no longer available for examination. Some of the neck tissues had been retained during the original state autopsy. The brain was unavailable for direct evaluation. The lungs and stomach had already been examined during the first autopsy, making certain drowning indicators impossible to reassess independently. Rather than declaring what happened, the private report identified what still needed to be investigated. Instead of closing the case, it raised even more questions. And those questions would soon shift attention away from the autopsy itself and towards something potentially even more important: the missing hours before Nolan entered the water. Because according to forensic experts, no medical examination can explain what happened before death without one critical piece of evidence: the investigation. As investigators continued examining the physical evidence, forensic experts kept returning to one unavoidable conclusion: the autopsy alone would never solve this case. Even the most detailed medical examination can only reveal what happened to a body. It cannot explain why those injuries occurred. It cannot identify who was present, and it cannot reconstruct the decisions made in the hours before death. That is where the criminal investigation becomes just as important as forensic science. The independent pathologist outlined several critical questions that still needed answers before anyone could confidently determine how Nolan died. The first and perhaps most important question was simple: how did Nolan enter the water? That may sound obvious at first, but in forensic investigations, the circumstances surrounding a person's entry into the water often determine the difference between an accident, suicide, homicide, or an undetermined death. Investigators needed to establish whether Nolan entered the water voluntarily, accidentally fell in, or was somehow incapacitated before reaching the water. Without that information, no pathologist could confidently determine the manner of death. The next major question involved Nolan's ability to swim. Family members described him as a capable swimmer. That immediately complicated the investigation. Healthy young adults who know how to swim do not simply disappear in calm conditions without raising questions. Forensic experts explain that when an experienced swimmer drowns, investigators must look beyond the body itself. They begin asking what might have prevented that person from getting back to safety. Was there a medical emergency? Did drugs or alcohol impair judgment? Did an injury occur before entering the water? Or did something happen involving another person? At this point, none of those possibilities had been confirmed. They simply represented the types of questions investigators routinely examine. Another key issue involved the condition of Nolan's body when it was recovered. Public discussion quickly became clouded by conflicting reports. Some online posts claimed he was found fully clothed. Others insisted he was wearing only swim trunks. The confusion became significant enough that the volunteer search organization involved in the recovery publicly corrected inaccurate statements circulating online. For investigators, those details matter. Small inaccuracies can dramatically change public perception, but they do not necessarily change the forensic evidence. Medical experts explain that the body's position in the water may help reconstruct what happened. Bodies can drift considerable distances depending on tides, currents, and weather conditions. The location where someone is found is not always the location where they entered the water. That makes search patterns, GPS data, and environmental conditions extremely important. Another unanswered question involved the airway and lungs. In drowning investigations, forensic pathologists often look for fluid within the lungs and airways. They also examine whether water entered the stomach. These findings can support drowning as the cause of death. However, because the original state autopsy had already examined those organs, the independent pathologist could not directly evaluate them during the second examination. That limitation prevented the private report from confirming or excluding certain drowning indicators. The toxicology results presented another challenge. Many people assume toxicology simply reveals whether alcohol or drugs were present. The reality is far more complicated. In bodies that have undergone advanced decomposition, bacteria naturally produce alcohol after death. That means a positive alcohol result does not automatically prove someone had been drinking before they died. Forensic toxicologists must carefully analyze where samples were collected and compare multiple laboratory findings before reaching reliable conclusions. Without the official toxicology report, speculation would be premature. The independent pathologist made another important observation involving the neck. Certain structures inside the neck are routinely examined in cases where investigators need to rule out strangulation or other forms of trauma. Those delicate tissues had been retained during the original examination and were unavailable during the second autopsy. Again, that did not suggest wrongdoing by either medical examiner. It simply reflected standard forensic procedure. Still, it meant another important piece of evidence remained outside the independent pathologist's review. One by one, the unanswered questions began forming a larger picture, not because they proved foul play, but because each missing answer prevented investigators from reaching a definitive conclusion. Perhaps the most revealing part of the private report was not what it claimed to know. It was what it openly admitted it could not determine. Rather than forcing a conclusion, the pathologist documented every limitation and explained exactly which additional evidence investigators would need before reaching a final opinion. That level of transparency highlighted an important reality about modern death investigations. Medical evidence rarely stands alone. Autopsy findings must be combined with witness interviews, phone records, surveillance footage, GPS data, laboratory testing, and digital evidence. Only when all of those pieces come together can investigators begin reconstructing the final hours of someone's life. And in Nolan Wells' case, many of those critical pieces had yet to become public. The investigation was no longer focused only on what happened inside the body. It was now focused on what happened outside it. Because somewhere between the July 4th celebration and the moment Nolan entered the water, investigators believed the missing timeline could hold the answers that the autopsy never could. As the forensic questions continued to grow, investigators increasingly shifted their attention toward something that could prove even more important than the autopsy: digital evidence. In nearly every modern death investigation, a person's final hours are reconstructed through technology: cell phones, location data, text messages, social media, photos, videos, surveillance cameras. Together, they often reveal details that witnesses forget, misunderstand, or choose not to disclose. For Nolan Wells, digital evidence may become the key to understanding exactly what happened after he arrived on Horn Island. One of the biggest mysteries involves his cell phone. According to information shared by the family, Nolan's phone somehow made it back to the mainland while he did not. That detail immediately raised questions. Who had possession of the phone? When did it leave the island? Who transported it? Was it powered on during that time? Did it connect to different cellular towers or Wi-Fi networks? Investigators can often answer those questions using forensic analysis. Modern smartphones continuously record location history, Bluetooth connections, wireless networks, and timestamps that can help reconstruct movement throughout the day. Even if messages have been deleted, specialized forensic software may recover portions of that data depending on the device and circumstances. Call records may also establish who Nolan communicated with during his final hours. Text messages could reveal changes in plans. Photos and videos often contain hidden metadata showing exactly when and where they were captured. If friends exchanged messages after Nolan disappeared, investigators will carefully compare those conversations with the official timeline. Another important source of evidence comes from social media. Holiday weekends often generate hundreds of photos and videos uploaded within minutes. People may unknowingly capture crucial background details while recording completely unrelated moments. Someone filming friends on a nearby boat might accidentally record another vessel passing in the distance. A selfie could capture individuals standing together only minutes before someone disappeared. Short video clips posted to Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, or Facebook frequently become valuable evidence because they document events exactly as they occurred. Investigators also examine deleted content. Many users believe deleting a post permanently removes it. In reality, digital traces often remain stored on cloud servers, backup systems, or within the devices themselves. Depending on legal authority and available technology, investigators may recover information that no longer appears visible to the public. Witness interviews become even more valuable when combined with digital evidence. Human memory is imperfect. People estimate time incorrectly. They confuse sequences of events. Stress and alcohol can make those problems even worse. Digital records provide objective timestamps that help investigators determine whether witness accounts are accurate. If someone claims Nolan was last seen at a certain time, investigators compare that statement with phone records, photographs, GPS information, and surveillance footage. Every inconsistency becomes another lead to investigate. Another area receiving close attention is the movement of boats around Horn Island that day. Many modern boats carry GPS navigation systems capable of recording routes, speeds, and stopping points. Some marinas also maintain security cameras that record vessels arriving and departing. If investigators obtain those records, they can compare them against witness statements and determine exactly when different groups left the island. Drone footage may also prove valuable. During busy holiday weekends, recreational drone operators frequently record aerial videos of beaches and boats. Even if Nolan was not intentionally filmed, investigators may search for publicly shared drone videos that captured portions of the island during the critical hours. Every image has the potential to provide another piece of the timeline. Authorities are also expected to review emergency communications. Every 911 call, every dispatch log, every radio transmission. Those records establish exactly when Nolan was first reported missing, when search efforts began, and how information developed throughout the investigation. The timeline surrounding those early decisions has received significant public attention because Nolan's family believes investigators concluded too quickly that his death appeared accidental. Whether that early assessment influenced the investigation remains an important question. Forensic experts stress that determining the manner of death requires far more than medical findings. It requires context. If evidence shows Nolan entered the water alone without signs of violence, investigators may reach one conclusion. If digital evidence reveals an altercation shortly before his disappearance, the investigation could take an entirely different direction. That is why detectives rarely rely on a single piece of evidence. Instead, they build a timeline minute by minute. Where was Nolan? Who was with him? Who saw him last? When was his phone active? What electronic evidence confirms those answers? Only after every piece fits together can investigators confidently explain what happened. At this stage, many of those answers remain confidential. Authorities have not publicly released the complete digital evidence. Witness interviews are ongoing. Laboratory testing continues, and investigators are carefully comparing every statement against the available forensic data. For Nolan's family, that waiting has been agonizing. For investigators, it is necessary because one overlooked phone record, one overlooked photograph, or one overlooked witness could completely change the direction of the case. And as the investigation moves closer to its final conclusions, attention is now turning toward the official autopsy, the grand jury review, and the difficult question that everyone has been asking since Nolan disappeared. Will the evidence ever provide a clear answer about how he died? Weeks after Nolan Wells' body was recovered, the investigation remained active, and many of the answers the public expected had still not arrived. The independent autopsy had not ruled the death an accident. It had not ruled it a homicide. Instead, it concluded that the available medical evidence could not determine exactly how Nolan died. For some observers, that conclusion was frustrating. For experienced investigators, it was not unusual. An undetermined manner of death does not mean investigators have failed. It means the available evidence does not yet support one conclusion over another. That distinction is critical. In death investigations, certainty cannot be based on assumptions or public opinion. It must be supported by evidence that can withstand scientific and legal scrutiny. As detectives continued reviewing witness statements, forensic testing, and digital evidence, another important process was taking place behind the scenes. The district attorney's office confirmed that investigators were still gathering evidence before making any final legal decisions. Officials emphasized that no conclusion would be announced until the investigation was complete. If prosecutors believe the evidence supports criminal charges, the case could eventually be presented to a grand jury. A grand jury does not determine guilt or innocence. Its role is to examine the available evidence and decide whether probable cause exists to move forward with criminal charges. If the evidence is insufficient, no indictment is issued. If enough evidence is presented, the case proceeds into the criminal court system. At this stage, however, authorities have not publicly announced that any individual has been charged in connection with Nolan's death. The investigation remains open. That fact alone explains why many details have not been released. Detectives often withhold key evidence to protect the integrity of an active investigation. Witness statements are compared against physical evidence. Digital records are verified. Laboratory reports are reviewed multiple times. Every piece must fit before investigators reach a final conclusion. Meanwhile, Nolan's family continues asking for transparency. They have repeatedly stated that they simply want the truth, whatever that truth may ultimately be. Their decision to seek an independent autopsy was never intended to replace the official investigation. Instead, they hoped it would ensure every possible question received careful examination. The private forensic report highlighted important limitations. It documented observations that deserved further review, but it also acknowledged where science could no longer provide definitive answers. That honesty may ultimately become one of the report's most valuable contributions. Rather than forcing a conclusion, it identified the evidence investigators still needed. Forensic experts interviewed throughout the case have consistently emphasized one message. Medical findings represent only one part of a much larger investigation. The final determination depends on combining pathology, toxicology, digital evidence, witness interviews, environmental analysis, and the complete investigative timeline. Only after every piece has been examined can investigators determine whether Nolan's death resulted from an accident, a natural medical emergency, the actions of another person, or whether the evidence will remain permanently inconclusive. Cases like this remind us why patience is often the most difficult part of any criminal investigation. Public speculation moves quickly. Facts do not. Every rumor shared online creates additional confusion. Every unsupported theory risks distracting attention from verified evidence. Investigators must separate facts from assumptions every single day. That process takes time. For now, several important questions remain unanswered. What exactly happened during Nolan's final hours on Horn Island? Why did the available evidence leave both the official investigation and the independent forensic examination with unresolved questions? Will digital evidence, witness testimony, or future forensic analysis eventually provide the missing pieces of the timeline? Those answers may determine not only how Nolan Wells died, but whether anyone could ultimately be held legally responsible. Until investigators complete their work, the case remains exactly where experienced detectives believe it should remain: open, carefully examined, and guided by evidence rather than speculation. For Nolan's family, the investigation represents far more than a legal process. It represents the search for certainty after an unimaginable loss. Whether that certainty ultimately arrives through forensic science, digital evidence, witness testimony, or future legal proceedings remains to be seen. But one thing is already clear: the search for the truth is not over.